Hi class, welcome to our last review video in this particular unit where we will be talking about chemical reactions and enzymes. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our learning targets for this video are explain how chemical reactions affect chemical bonds, describe how energy changes affect how easily a chemical reaction will occur, and explain why enzymes are important to living things. So by the end of this review video, hopefully you will be able to do these things. So let's get started with chemical reactions. Hopefully this is, again, a review from physical science. So what is a chemical reaction? It is simply a process that changes one set of chemicals into another set of chemicals. Think about it as changing a set of compounds into another set of compounds. Either way, we're taking substance A and we are producing substance B. So we're going to talk a little bit about chemical reactions. Chemical reactions are at the base of much of biology. When we get to some more complicated units, such as things like DNA, cellular respiration, photosynthesis, you're going to see a lot of chemical reactions taking place. All right, so chemical reactions. Chemical reactions generally involve changes in energy, where that energy change comes from, where it goes, and what happens to that energy. Chemical reactions usually have an energy release or an energy utilization. What that means is a chemical reaction is going to require energy to get going, or it's going to release energy as it takes place. Oftentimes we can recognize an energy release because we feel heat or we see light. And we can recognize the need for energy because it's usually energy that we have to supply to the system. All of this is burning hydrogen gas to produce water. You take the hydrogen and you take the oxygen that's in the air and you burn it or ignite it, you're going to get water vapor. This reaction is going to produce an immense amount of energy, and usually you're going to recognize that energy as light or heat. So if we were going to write this chemical reaction out, it would look something like this. You would have two hydrogens, and we'll review chemical equations. You would have two hydrogen molecules, and then you would combine that with your oxygen molecules, and you would get your reaction that would produce water. But what you're going to get is light and probably some heat. So you're going to recognize that this is a huge chemical reaction. The reverse, however, water and produce hydrogen gas and oxygen requires a ton of energy. So much so that this doesn't actually happen on its own. If you want to take water and break it into its hydrogen and its oxygen components, you actually have to supply an electrical current. You have to supply energy in order to allow this chemical reaction to take place. So chemical reactions are going to require an energy release or an energy utilization in some capacity. Additionally, chemical reactions can be fast or slow. Sorry, I'll erase my chemical reaction there. Chemical reactions can be fast or slow. Chemical reactions can take place over long periods of time. Think about the rusting of a car or the rusting of any sort of metal that's exposed to seawater. Or they can be really, really fast, instantaneous almost. A lot of those really fast reactions are the ones that happen inside of your body. So we'll be talking about chemical reactions all throughout the year. Okay, so let's take a look at some chemical reactions, some vocabulary from last year. So the elements or compounds that enter into the chemical reaction are known as the reactants. The reactants are those molecules that are found in the circle on the blue side. And so that's, in this case scenario, one methane molecule and two oxygen molecules. Now, the elements or compounds that are produced by a chemical reaction are known as the products. And in this case scenario, they are represented by those that fall under the red circle. Our products in this case are going to be one carbon dioxide molecule and two water molecules. Get familiar with recognizing the reactants and the products of chemical reactions because you'll be dealing with a lot of chemical reactions this year. Some good examples are just starting right off with things like photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That we're going to spend a lot of time on those chemical reactions, but they're a little more complex than these ones. All right, so in a chemical reaction, some bonds are broken and some bonds are formed. The process of a chemical reaction usually requires a break and a form of a bond. And this is where some of that energy is either released or going to be required. Use water as our example just to keep it simple. So we know that our chemical reaction for water, sorry about that. We know that our chemical reaction for water is going to be 2 hydrogen molecules, and that's going to give it plus 1 oxygen molecule, which will yield about 2 H2O molecules. All right? So again, chemical reaction is taking place. We need to break some bonds and form some bonds. Now, if you look at the bonds between these hydrogen molecules, it might look something like this. This is 1 hydrogen molecule here, and we have 2 of those. And then we have our oxygens. And our oxygens are going to be held together like this. Okay, now, in order to actually build a water molecule, we need to break apart some of the molecules that we already have. To break apart the bonds between our hydrogen molecules, and we'll need to break apart the bonds between our oxygen molecules. Then we need to reform them so they look like this. We have our oxygen, and then we have our hydrogen. And we'll have 2 of those. It's this process here, the breaking, and here, the forming of chemical bonds, that actually causes the requirement or the release of energy. Whenever chemical bonds are formed or broken, energy is given off or taken in. This means chemical reactions involve energy changes. And so now we need to talk about those energy changes, what they are, how they happen, and why they're important. Okay, so let's spend some time talking about these energy changes. Chemical reactions that release energy often occur spontaneously. So if we have a release of energy, we most likely have a spontaneous reaction. What that really means is the reaction is going to take place on its own. It doesn't need any help to get going. Chemical reactions that require energy or absorb energy are not going to happen spontaneously, which means they require a source of energy. Think back to the beginning of our review video when I used water as an example. Taking water and breaking it up into hydrogen and oxygen is not going to happen spontaneously. It requires a lot of energy to make that happen. So we have to supply an energy source if we want to break the chemical bonds found in that water molecule in order to release the hydrogen and oxygen. So here's our example. When hydrogen gas reacts with oxygen to produce water vapor, it is an energy-releasing reaction in which energy is given off typically as heat. So we'd have something like this. However, if we wanted to reverse the reaction, like I've already mentioned, we would have to supply some sort of electrical current. This is what it kind of looks like. Don't worry too much about the nitty-gritties, it's just an example, but it demonstrates how you would supply the energy to break these chemical bonds to allow a change in the reactants and products. So you can't really reverse this energy or this chemical reaction without adding energy. So you would supply an electrical current to both these sides, and then oxygen gas would be released and hydrogen gas would be released. So again, a spontaneous reaction is one that's going to take place without needed energy input, and a non-spontaneous reaction is an energy reaction that's going to require an input. So where does the energy sources come from? Where do the energy sources come from, rather? Because there are a lot of chemical reactions, especially taking place in your body right now. In all living organisms, chemical reactions are going to be at the base. So if they're at the base, then where does this energy come from? Well, in order to stay alive, organisms need energy to carry out chemical reactions in their body, but these chemical reactions don't happen on their own, so you consume food, right? The energy that you get from your food is also the energy that powers the chemical reactions that take place in your body. If you're a plant, that comes from photosynthesis that allows you to produce sugars that you as a human ultimately end up consuming, which powers the energetic processes in your body. Park it here because we'll spend a lot of time talking about energy sources and where energy comes from and how you absorb that energy. But it's important to know that the energy doesn't come out of thin air. In fact, you actually have to consume it in some way. But let's talk about how these energy changes are important. And so we know that you get your energy from food, but why exactly is this energy overwhelmingly important? Well, part of it is because energy is required to get these reactions to take place. Activation energy is the energy that is needed in order for a reaction to start. And this is the amount of energy required for a chemical reaction to take place. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. So here we have an energy absorbing reaction on this side, and over here we have an energy releasing reaction. You can see the difference between the energy absorbing reaction and the energy releasing reaction and the amount of activation energy that is required. Notice that the reactants are on the side here, and the products are up here and down here. We have energy, an increase of energy on the x-axis, or sorry, on the y-axis, my mistake, and then we have the course of the reaction on the x-axis down here for both of these graphs. The activation energy here is the amount of energy required for the reactants to become the products. You can see in the energy absorbing reaction, the activation energy required is much greater than that releases energy, or energy releasing reaction. The reaction will not be able to take place until this activation energy is achieved. So upward we go, we have our reactants. Oh, sorry about that. Up we go, we have our reactants, and then finally when the activation energy is achieved, the chemical reaction can progress and the products can be produced. If you don't have the activation energy, you cannot, or the chemical reaction cannot occur. Now, sometimes the speed at which these chemical reactions take place is too slow and is not going to be beneficial for your body. It might be true that some of these chemical reactions will take place on their own eventually. We don't always have time to wait for them to take place. So that's where enzymes come into play. Enzymes are a type of catalyst, or more like a natural type of catalyst. Catalysts are things that are going to lower the activation energy required to get a chemical reaction started. They're basically going to speed up the process. And the catalysts that your body uses are called enzymes. So, many reactions in living things require this catalyst, or the speeding up of a chemical reaction, and enzymes are the proteins that actually make this happen. So think back to our last review video where we learned about biologic macromolecules. One of the things you learned about were proteins. Well, while you typically like to think of protein as chicken or beef, you can also think of proteins as enzymes. Enzymes are a type of protein that work as catalysts inside living organisms to lower this activation energy. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions that take place within a cell. So here I have a graph that shows you, again, on the y-axis the energy and on the x-axis the course of the reaction. You have the reactants over here and the products over here. Then you have this blue line that shows you the activation energy required without a catalyst. So in order for this chemical reaction to take place spontaneously, this is how much activation energy it would need. However, your body has these magical creatures called enzymes. They're not really creatures, they're not alive. Magical things, they're not really magic. It's science. But they have enzymes which lower the activation energy and allow this chemical reaction to take place spontaneously much quicker. So enzymes are usually extraordinarily specific. They only work on one chemical reaction in the body. This is okay because enzymes typically aren't used up in these chemical reactions. So here are some examples of enzymes that function in your body. Catalase is an enzyme that helps break down hydrogen peroxide in your liver. I bet you didn't know that you produced hydrogen peroxide. Well, if it builds up, it's technically a poison for you. Luckily, you have this amazing organ called the liver that takes care of this. This process would be way too slow to happen on its own. If you did not have catalase to help break down hydrogen peroxide in your liver, you would most likely die from too much hydrogen peroxide. Another enzyme is called amylase. This is found in our saliva and turns starch into sugar. And if you've ever chewed on, let's say, saltine crackers for a really long time, you may have found that the saltine crackers slowly start tasting sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And that's because the amylase in your saliva is going to break down those starches into sugars. In fact, if you happen to have some saltine crackers in your pantry and you're feeling like you need a little snack and you're getting kind of bored, go grab some saltine crackers and chew on them. You have to chew on them for a very long time. But eventually you will start to taste a shift from the saltiness in the cracker into the more sugary taste performed by the amylase found in your saliva. We'll also have an enzyme called DNA polymerase. Now, don't forget about DNA polymerase. We're going to talk about DNA polymerase second semester, and it's really a fascinating enzyme. It is necessary in order to help create DNA molecules by putting nucleotides together. Now, you might not have any idea what that means, but we're going to talk about it. So DNA polymerase is another enzyme found in your body to make this happen. Again, all of these things might eventually happen, but they're going to happen too slow. Could you imagine if your body could never break down hydrogen peroxide, if your body could never change starches into sugars, or if your body couldn't actually process or make a new DNA? These processes need to occur, and they need to occur in a timely manner. Oh, sorry about that. So without enzyme reactions in your body would be too slow, and eventually you would die because your body would not be able to maintain homeostasis. So enzymes are critical for maintaining that stable internal balance that keeps you you. Enzymes are going to come up multiple times this year. So remember, enzymes are a type of protein and nature's natural catalysts that help lower the activation energy of a chemical reaction so that it happens quicker. Now let's talk a little bit about the enzyme substrate complex. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there are some important things to know about enzymes. This is how enzymes actually do their job. For a chemical reaction to take place, the reactants have to hit each other with enough energy for existing bonds to break and for new bonds to form. So how do they do that? They do that via the enzyme substrate complex. Enzymes provide a site where reactants can be brought together to react, reducing the energy need for the chemical reaction. The reactants of these enzyme-catalyzed reactions are known as substrates. So they fit together kind of like a lock and a key. The substrate is very specific to the enzyme, the enzyme is very specific to the substrate. So here I have an example. We've got an enzyme we have an enzyme right down here. And notice we have what's called the active site on the enzyme. Well, what's going to happen is the substrate is going to bond to the active site. The enzyme is going to allow the chemical reaction to take place, and then the products are going to be released. And this happens in multiple different ways. Essentially, the enzyme substrate complex works kind of like a dance floor to bring people together. Think about going to a bigger school, right? At Cascade, we're a small school. You know everybody in your school. But if you went to a school with like 1,000 other students, you might never meet everybody that goes to that school. However, if you all decide to go to homecoming, or if you all decide to go to Tolo, the chances that you're going to meet other people from the school increase because you're all being brought together on one common dance floor. So, this is kind of how an enzyme works. You have an enzyme. Inside your enzyme, you have an active site. What happens is the substrates bond to the active site here, fitting ever so perfectly. The substrates are then converted into the products, which then get released. Again, these chemical reactions might take place without these enzymes. However, the enzymes allow for this process to be a little bit quicker. So again, here is the active site. The active site is where the substrate binds. You can think about the substrate as like the reactants from the reaction. And the substrate is what the enzyme is acting upon, and eventually the substrate is going to be broken down into the products. And again, if it helps you, you can think of the substrate as kind of like the reactants. So the products are what the enzyme changes the substrate into. Usually there are 2 or 3 products that come out of these enzyme-catalyzed reactions. Enzymes alter the substrates into the products. The enzymes remain unchanged in a reaction and get to be reused. So just because your enzyme got used once doesn't mean it can't be used again. Now that we've freed up this active site right here, there's room for new substrates to come and bond and be a part of this enzyme substrate complex again. Now, while enzymes get used up or get used over and over again for chemical reactions, there are a few things that can ruin enzymes. And when an enzyme gets ruined, we call this denaturing. When the protein structure is altered and the substrate can no longer fit into the active site, it's denatured. Remember, back in our last review video, we talked about how we can denature proteins by changing things like temperature and pH. Well, that's true for enzymes. It's one of the reasons why maintaining a good homeostatic balance inside of your body is important, because your body is made up of many, many proteins, including enzymes. And these enzymes allow chemical reactions in your body to take place at the proper speed. So this is what might happen if we denatured a protein. What happens is it changes the conformation or the shape of the active site, so the substrate no longer fits. If the substrate doesn't fit in the active site, the enzyme can't break down or allow the chemical reaction to take place, and the products can't be produced. So what causes denaturing? We talked a little bit about this in our last review video. Things like temperature, pH, and heavy metals are all things that can denature or change the shape of a protein. Remember, if we change the shape of a protein, it no longer functions properly. We like our enzymes, and they're extraordinarily important to our bodies, so they have to be regulated. Enzymes can be affected by variables that influence a chemical reaction, such as pH values, changes in temperatures, and the enzyme or substrate concentration. If you have more enzymes than you do substrates, then this reaction is going to progress a little bit quicker. However, if you have more substrates than you do enzymes, this reaction might progress a little bit slower. Things like pH values and changes in temperatures can denature your enzymes, making them no longer functional. So your enzymes have to be regulated and controlled to continue the process of chemical reactions in your body. Enzymes in your body function best at body temperature, which is about 37 degrees Celsius or maybe 98 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Some sort of body temperature. There are some other enzymes that function better at a little bit higher temperatures or a little bit lower temperatures or higher or lower pHs. But in general, the normal balance of U is also the normal for enzyme action as well. In this video, we've talked about chemical reactions. So ask yourself, can you explain how chemical reactions affect chemical bonds? What is the relationship between a chemical reaction and a chemical bond? Can you describe how energy changes affect how easily a chemical reaction will occur? And can you explain why enzymes are important to living things? What's the point of an enzyme? What do they do? Why are they important? Hopefully this review video has been helpful for you, and I'll see you in our next unit with our next section of videos.